Okay, so welcome to 401 Church History. So session 3. Where did our bishops and our Bible come from? During this session, we're going to be looking at the Apostolic Fathers through to the Apologists. The aim is to learn what happened to the church in the first couple of hundred years after Paul died. How the church came to be led by bishops. What happened to women, prophets, and the charismatic movement. Actually, I'm not going to look at that. That's the Montanists at the very end of this chapter. Read it for yourselves. How the second generation Christians used culture around them to evangelize. Come to that shortly. The first two bits of misthinking about Jesus and how we come to have our Bible. So there you go. Quite quickly, the churches gathered around a single bishop to lead them. The Montanists stuffed it up for women and the charismatic movement. Early heresies of Docetism and Gnosticism got Christians thinking more deeply. Marcion, boo, helped us to figure out which books to put in the Bible. Alright, there's your cheap summary. Here's a little cheap. We start off with this understanding that there really are only two heresies. At least when it comes to Jesus. And the idea is where you overemphasize the humanity, and the other is where you overemphasize the divinity, and how we work out our language and how we balance that. And that is basically going to be the prime lecture for the next 3 or 4 lectures, is how we as a church have come to see Jesus and how we talk about Jesus. This is your cathedral essay, your cathedral assignment. And this is how we're going to balance it. And we start off with some people known as the Ebionites, the poor ones. We don't really know much about them. Indeed, in terms of we really don't know very much about them. But the Ebionites seem to have had this view that Jesus was an adopted son of God. Jesus was a really nice bloke, and God went, "You're really nice. I am going to adopt you as my son." So we have for that the symbolic ring. You are an adopted son. And this was how Roman culture worked. Very often they would adopt children, possibly even slaves. Josephus himself becomes an adopted son of Flavius. And so he would have been given probably a ring, a symbol that this is the house that you belong to. And so they are the adopted ring. And that's why this is symbolic of this heresy known as adoptionism. You're familiar with it from the Bible passage where we see Jesus being baptized, and Jesus comes up out of the water, and then the dove comes upon him. Is this a moment then when Jesus is adopted to be the Son of God? "Behold my Son, with whom I am well pleased." Or not, because actually if your conclusion is, if you're not already thinking adoptionist thoughts, there's no need to see it in that way. So, here you go, Jesus as an adopted son. Now, the next heresy is the extreme opposite, and it's known as Docetism. So that's why I've got a Groucho mask here. I'm going to put my Groucho mask on. Jesus, Docetism. Now the Docetism one is from the Greek dokeo, meaning I seem. And so Jesus merely seems to be human. Here, Jesus in adoptionism, here Jesus is human, but he's given special powers, like Moses, like Elijah, like so many Old Testament prophets, with the Holy Spirit. He's given special powers to do special things. He's an adopted Son of God. Here, Jesus is completely divine. He just seems to be human. All right, so this is your Clark Kent idea at the end. Clark Kent, he is really Superman. He's not really human. He pretends to get hurt when he's being Clark Kent, and he gets hit. But the moment that he's Superman, it's all clear. So this is your dokeo, your Docetism, your seeming to be. And these are your two extreme ends of heresies. We're going to be exploring those a little bit more as we go along. Page 13, you've got references here to Pliny about early church worship. So have a read of that, and into what's called the Didache. Now the Didache, this is really good. Michael Holmes's translation of the Apostolic Fathers. I thoroughly recommend this to you, but it's really not relevant for most of your essays, so don't worry about it too much. But in here you will find the Didache. Didache is spelled Didache. Please don't say that, okay? It'll just make everyone else cringe. And it's the teachings, and in here, it's very short writing, the Didache, but you get the first of the Lord's Prayers that's got the doxology added to the end. We have wisdom here about how to go about baptizing somebody, how to do a Eucharist, how to spot if you've got a charlatan a prophet who's come to visit you and scam you, how to spot that sort of thing. So it's brilliant. But also in here, you've got the writings of a man called Ignatius of Antioch. And he is the first person to use the word bishop in the singular. If you look into your scriptures, you'll enjoy how much the word bishop, episkopoi, is plural, episkopoi. And so you'll see plural bishops. Ignatius of Antioch is the first one who refers to the singular bishop. And so scholars have come to term this monarchical episcopalism, because that's what scholars like doing. If they can find a simple way of saying something, they will find a complicated way of doing it. Monarchical, the rule of one, one, archical, rule, episcopalism, epi over scopolism, sia. So it's about one rule over sia, the rule of one bishop. And that's what that's all about. Ignatius of Antioch. You've come across him before when we were talking about persecution. He was writing in his letter to the Romans about how much he was looking forward to martyrdom. But one of the things that he's addressing is Docetism. He seems to have become aware that there are these folk who view Jesus as divine. They haven't got a problem with Jesus being divine, that's great, it's easy. But they see Jesus as pretending to be human. That's not a negative point from the Docetists' perspective. They think that's great. But he's been sent from God as God. He is divine, not human. And so alongside all of this, oh yeah, so you've got to keep asking yourself things like this. Who's on the cross? You see, so if you have an adoptionism Christ on your cross, then on the cross, what you have is a really nice bloke. God said, oh, there's a really nice bloke. I'm going to adopt him as my son. Tell you what, let's kill him. So when you come to looking at the cross, what you see is what Steve Chalke referred to as domestic child abuse. And you can go, oh, well, that makes sense if you're looking at adoptionism as your understanding of who Christ is. He is fully human, but he's merely adopted as the Son of God. The alternative, of course, here in your Docetism is there's Jesus, the Clark Kent God, on the cross, and as he's being nailed, he's going ow, but it's not really ow because he's Clark Kent. He's God. What does that matter? It doesn't matter at all. It doesn't hurt. He's just pretending that it hurts. He's only pretending. So you're left going, well, what kind of pretense sacrifice am I seeing here? And so neither ends up being very satisfactory as an answer. Now, into this mess comes Gnosticism. And in Gnosticism from the Greek word nokeo, but with a g in front, all right? And gnosko. And it is knowledge. So Gnosticism is simply the Greek word for knowledge. And within the Gnostics is this idea of, I've got secret knowledge. You pray this special prayer, then you will get to go to heaven, and then all will be well. So they came over as people who had secret knowledge of things. It wasn't exclusively a Christian thing. They brought in all sorts of gatherings of other religious views, but it did take on a Christian twist with certain folks. Now, into this messy mix comes a guy called Marcion. And Marcion is the first guy who goes, I don't really like the Old Testament. Okay, he can't be the first person to say that. But there must have been that he looked at his Bible and he went, the Old Testament is just full of nastiness. We don't like it. So I'm going to get rid of the Old Testament. He looked at the New Testament and he went, I don't really like this either. It's a bit too Jewish. Yes, well, there you are. And so what he did is he tore out a whole bunch of stuff there, and mostly we're left with the Gospel of Luke, and we're left with some of the letters of Paul that he thought were okay. And there's a sense in which, and this is a cheap seat way of talking about it, in which because Marcion starts saying, well, this is what I want in my Bible, everybody else goes, all right, okay, well, let's have a think about it. What do we want in our Bible? So we have the beginnings of this understanding of, well, what should we have in our Bible? Now, you'll be familiar with how the word canon is just a word meaning rule or ruler. A measuring rule is what it's about. And it's about what is going to keep me on the straight and narrow, if you like. You'll have already talked about oral tradition, so I won't touch on that, but instead point you to a guy called Papias, and how Papias wrote about the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark, and things like that, and you've got those all in your notes on page 18. So we know that from a very early stage, the four Gospels were just the four Gospels. They were pretty solid and settled down. And we have a thing called the Mauritanian canon. Now this is a fragment, and it's missing Matthew and Mark. It's where it's torn. It starts with and Luke and John. So we're kind of hoping that the two words before it might have been Matthew and Mark. That certainly would fit. And then you've got the rest. You've got Acts. You've got all 13 Pauline letters, including the pastoral epistles. You've got 1 and 2 John, and you've got Revelation. And you've got all this stuff written down. What you've not got is Hebrews, 1 and 2 Peter, and 3 John. But it does refer to the Apocalypse of Peter, which some of us allow to be read in church. Now that little phrase, which some of us allow to be read in church, indicates this is what sort of counts as canon. Is if you're happy, there's all sorts of stuff that you read at home. Good for you, well done, read it at home. But there's other stuff that we read when we gather as a church. And so some of us are allowing this book, this Apocalypse of Peter. And it's this public canon of what's being allowed. Now in 367, there's a bishop called Athanasius. He's the Bishop of Alexandria, and he wrote what's known as a Paschal letter. And it's the letter saying, this is when we're going to have Easter Day. You're going to have Easter Day on this day, and here you are. The Council of Nicaea gave powers to the Bishop of Alexandria to set Easter. You sort it out. Let us know when you think it is. We'll all do it on that day. Cheers, mate. So Athanasius finds himself the Bishop of Alexandria, and in 367 he sends out his letter going, Dear lovelies, this is when we're having Easter. By the way, this is what I'm reading. And so 367, Athanasius writes the complete list of 27 books of New Testament writings that we have. And that's where we have our first written list of what is down. You've got to bear in mind that Athanasius was the John Stott of his day. And so there's a sense in which, well, if that's what Athanasius says, fair dues, we'll go with that. And so there isn't sort of the debate and the argument and the disagreement that we kind of expect. There's a mutual sense of, well, what are you reading? I'm reading this. What are you reading? There's a mutual sense of sharing. And every now and then there's a little bit of Athanasius says, here are some books that are good for reading. If you're new to this Christian life, you should read the Didache, First Clement, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you about those because that would just make this really long. But the Shepherd of Hermas is awesome, and you should definitely read it. It's brilliant. And so it's First Clement. Stop it. Okay, what about the Old Testament? Let's have a momentary pause on the Old Testament. So when I was little, we were told that there was a Jewish council called Jamnia in the year 100, And the Jews sat down and went, we're having that and we're not having that. And they made a decision. That's in, that's not in. Now, we really cannot find any evidence that there actually was a council at Jamnia. What we can find is a place called Yavne, which is Jamnia. So at Yavne, there was a gathering of rabbis over a period of about a decade, and it does seem that there is no actual council, no hammer moment of this is in, this is out. But it does seem that the basic thrust of it was, if you can find a Hebrew original, then we'll keep it, and if you can't, then we won't. Which is why you find that Jews around about this time, they let go of books like the Book of Judith, the Book of Maccabees, the Book of Tobit, seem to be let go of. Christians, on the other hand, didn't. The Christians, they weren't at this period of gathering. They weren't rabbis at Yavne, and so instead they kept a hold of these books, and so that's why they've come down to us as our Apocrypha. And it's only in the Reformation where you get Luther, who turns to the Jews and say, well, what are you reading? What do you think is sacred? And as a result, he then separates out these books from those books. To be fair to Jerome, he's the guy who's going to translate the Vulgate, the Latin Bible. He's going to get all these Bibles and look at different translations. He's going to go back to the original Hebrew and translate it into the Latin, and it's going to be the most widely read Bible ever. I know you thought it was the NIV. Turns out it's the Vulgate. It's the most widely read Bible in our global history, and he's not sure about certain books. The Book of Judith would be a good example. He said, I couldn't find a Hebrew version, but Augustine said, oh, go on, and so he did. So he translated it anyway. He says I did a rough translation. An overnighter. Wasn't really that fussed about it. So who knows what versions he was using. But that's why we have those books to us. And that's why Christians have this sort of funny relationship with the Apocrypha. Most of you probably got a little Protestant in you that says, no, they're wrong, they're apocryphal. But there'll be others who will be going, well, actually, no, they've been a part of the church's story for all this period. But if you look in your articles of faith at the back of your BCP, you'll see what it says about it. And I will leave you to do that. There you go. We've done our list. I will see you shortly for episode 4.